My mother-in-law was extremely abusive, so my husband and I had cut off all contact with her. However, when she found out that we had built a new house, she showed up at the housewarming with a lot of luggage, declaring she would use the main bedroom. But with just one sentence from me, she started crying, and I burst out laughing because... Let me take you back to where this all began. 3 years ago, I was Patricia Martinez, a woman who had finally found her voice after years of silence. My husband Michael and I had just signed the papers on our dream home, a beautiful 2-story house with large windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. As I held those keys in my trembling hands, they felt like more than just metal. They were symbols of freedom, of a life we had built together, away from the toxicity that had once consumed us. You see, cutting contact with Michael's mother hadn't been easy. For years, I had endured her constant criticism, her manipulation, her way of making me feel like I was never good enough for her son. But we had done it. We had chosen our peace over her chaos, and for 3 blissful years, we had lived in harmony. Do you believe in perfect happiness? Because for a moment there, I thought I had found mine. Our housewarming party was supposed to be a celebration of everything we had overcome. I spent weeks planning every detail, the decorations, the menu, the guest list filled with people who genuinely cared about us. That morning, I woke up with butterflies of excitement in my stomach. I remember standing in our kitchen, arranging flowers in a vase, thinking to myself, I deserve this happiness. We deserve this peace. Have you ever felt so content that you almost waited for something to go wrong? That's exactly how I felt as I heard the doorbell ring for the first time that afternoon. But it was just our neighbors, the Johnsons, arriving with a bottle of wine and warm smiles. Then came my college friends, Michael's co-workers, people who had supported us through our healing journey. Everything was perfect, maybe too perfect. The afternoon sun was streaming through our living room windows when the doorbell rang again. I was laughing at something my friend Sarah had said, wiping tears of joy from my eyes as I walked toward the front door. "More guests!" I called out cheerfully to Michael, who was grilling burgers on our back patio. "Our home is so full of love today." But when I opened that door, my blood turned to ice. There she stood, Margaret, my mother-in-law, whom we hadn't seen or spoken to in 3 years. But she wasn't alone. Behind her sat 3 large suitcases and what looked like enough belongings to move in permanently. Her steel gray eyes met mine with that familiar look of entitlement I remembered all too well. "Hello, Patricia," she said, her voice carrying that same condescending tone that used to make me shrink into myself. "I heard about your little housewarming party. How thoughtful of you not to invite family." And that's when I realized something that made my skin crawl. She knew. She knew about our new house, about our party, about our lives that we thought we had kept private. After 3 years of no contact, she had somehow been watching us, gathering information, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now here's where the story gets interesting, and I need you to pay attention because what happened next changed everything. You see, for 3 years, I had been living under the illusion that cutting contact meant we were free. I thought we had escaped her web of manipulation and control. But as I stood there, looking at those suitcases, I realized that our freedom had been nothing more than a beautiful lie. Margaret pushed past me without invitation, her eyes scanning our home with the calculating gaze of someone who was already making herself comfortable. "This will do nicely," she announced, as if she were inspecting a hotel room she had reserved. "I'll be taking the master bedroom, of course. At my age, I need proper support for my back." The party guests had started to notice the commotion. Conversations died down as people turned to see what was happening. I could feel their eyes on us, could sense the tension building in our beautiful, peaceful home. Michael appeared from the backyard, his face going pale when he saw his mother standing in our living room. But here's what none of those guests knew, what Margaret didn't know, and what even Michael didn't fully understand yet. I wasn't the same woman she had bullied 3 years ago. You see, during our time of healing, I hadn't just been recovering from her abuse. I had been preparing for this moment, even if I didn't fully realize it at the time. Those 3 years of no contact hadn't just been about peace and quiet. They had been about transformation. While Margaret thought she was dealing with the same submissive woman who used to cower under her criticism, she was actually facing someone completely different. Someone who had spent 3 years learning about her rights, studying the law, and most importantly, learning to value herself. Do you want to know a secret? I had actually expected this day to come. Not exactly like this, not at our housewarming party, but I knew that someone like Margaret, someone who thrived on control and manipulation, wouldn't stay away forever, especially not when she discovered that we had built something beautiful without her. As she stood there in our living room, demanding the master bedroom as if it were her birthright, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when facing her. I felt calm, eerily, dangerously calm, because while she had spent 3 years plotting her return, I had spent 3 years becoming someone she couldn't break. The woman standing before her wasn't the scared, people-pleasing daughter-in-law she remembered. This woman had learned to set boundaries. This woman had studied property law in her spare time. This woman had security cameras installed throughout the house. And this woman was about to teach Margaret a lesson she would never forget. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you exactly how Margaret had been tracking us, because that's where this story gets truly disturbing. During those 3 years of supposed no contact, she had been anything but absent from our lives. She had been watching, learning, gathering intelligence like some sort of family spy. She knew we had bought the house 6 months ago. She knew I had gotten a promotion at the law firm where I worked. She knew Michael had started therapy to deal with his childhood trauma. She knew our schedules, our friends, even our favorite restaurants. How? Because she had never really let us go. She had simply become more subtle in her stalking. Through social media, through mutual acquaintances, through methods I'm still discovering, she had maintained surveillance over our lives. The 3 years of peace we thought we had gained were actually 3 years of being unknowingly observed and assessed. Margaret had been planning this invasion for months, waiting for the perfect moment to reassert her control over our lives. And now, standing in our home with her suitcases, declaring her intention to move into our master bedroom, she thought she held all the cards. She thought she could waltz back into our lives and pick up where she had left off, with her as the dominant force and us as her obedient subjects. What she didn't know was that I had cards of my own to play. But first I had to deal with the immediate situation. Our guests were watching this family drama unfold in real time, and I could see the discomfort in their eyes. Some were probably wondering if they should leave. Others might have been curious about what would happen next. All of them were witnessing what was supposed to be our celebration turning into a confrontation. Margaret, sensing that she had an audience, began to perform. "Oh, Patricia, dear," she said in that sickly sweet voice that used to make my stomach turn. "You look so thin. Haven't you been eating properly? And this house, it's quite ambitious for someone your age. I do hope you can afford the mortgage payments." Each word was designed to diminish me, to make me feel small and inadequate in front of our friends. It was the same psychological warfare she had used for years, the same tactics that had once reduced me to tears. She was testing to see if I would revert to my old patterns of submission and self-doubt. But as I stood there, listening to her passive-aggressive comments, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling hurt or embarrassed, I started to feel something else entirely. I started to feel sorry for her. Here was a woman so desperate for control, so unable to respect boundaries, that she would crash a party uninvited and try to move into someone else's home. And that's when I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of engaging in her game, instead of defending myself or trying to manage her behavior, I was going to do something that would expose her for exactly what she was, a manipulative woman who had no legal right to be in my home. You see, While Margaret had spent 3 years gathering information about us, I had spent 3 years learning about something far more powerful, the law. Specifically, property law, tenant rights, and what constitutes trespassing. I had learned these things initially to protect myself from landlords and understand my rights as a homeowner, but I was about to discover they had a much more immediate application. As Margaret continued her performance for our guests, talking about how she would redecorate her room and what changes she would make to improve our home, I quietly reached for my phone. With a few quick taps, I activated the recording app that I had learned to use during my legal studies. Everything she was saying, every claim of ownership, every threat, every manipulation tactic was being documented. Do you think I was being too calculating, too prepared? Maybe. But you have to understand that people like Margaret don't respond to kindness or reasonable requests. They respond to strength, to consequences, and to the realization that their usual tactics won't work. Michael, meanwhile, was struggling with his own emotions. I could see the old patterns of fear and compliance warring with his newer understanding of healthy boundaries. 3 years of therapy had taught him to recognize his mother's manipulation, but facing her in person brought back all those childhood memories of being controlled and criticized. "Mom," he started, his voice uncertain, "we didn't invite you here. We've been very clear about our boundaries." Margaret turned on him with the speed of a predator, sensing weakness. "Boundaries?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I'm your mother, Michael. I don't need an invitation to visit my son. And after all the sacrifices I made raising you, this is how you repay me, by abandoning me in my old age." The emotional manipulation was textbook perfect. She had managed to position herself as the victim, make Michael feel guilty, and completely ignore the fact that she was trespassing in our home. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, and I could see it working on Michael despite all his therapy and growth. But here's what Margaret didn't know, and what I was about to reveal to everyone in that room. While she had been perfecting her manipulation tactics, I had been documenting every instance of her past abuse. I had been building a case, gathering evidence, and preparing for the day when her behavior would cross from emotional manipulation into legal violations. And demanding to live in our master bedroom? That crossed the line into criminal trespassing. So as Margaret continued her performance, as Michael struggled with his programmed responses, and as our guests watched this family drama unfold, I made my move. But it wasn't the move anyone expected, least of all Margaret. I smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a fake smile, but a genuine smile of someone who finally understood that she held all the power in this situation. Because while Margaret was playing the same old emotional games, I was about to introduce her to an entirely new playing field, one where her tactics not only wouldn't work, but would actually work against her. And that smile? That was just the beginning of Margaret's very bad day. That smile I gave Margaret wasn't born of malice or revenge. It was the smile of someone who had been playing a completely different game all along. You see, while everyone in that room thought they were witnessing a spontaneous family confrontation, they were actually watching the final act of a carefully orchestrated plan that had been 3 years in the making. Here's what nobody knew, not even Michael. I had been expecting this day for over a year. You think I'm crazy, don't you? You're wondering how I could have possibly predicted that Margaret would show up at our housewarming party with suitcases, demanding our master bedroom. But here's the thing about people like Margaret. They're predictable in their unpredictability. They can't help themselves. Give them success to destroy, happiness to poison, or peace to shatter, and they'll show up like clockwork. 6 months ago, when we first started house hunting, I hired a private investigator named David Chen, not to spy on Margaret, though that ended up being part of it, but to protect us from her. I needed to know if she was monitoring our lives, if she was planning something, and most importantly, I needed evidence of any illegal behavior she might engage in when she inevitably tried to reassert control over our lives. David had been worth every penny. Through his investigation, I learned that Margaret had been tracking our social media through fake accounts, following us to restaurants, even driving by our old apartment building to see if we still lived there. She had contacted Michael's workplace pretending to be concerned about a family emergency. She had tried to access our banking information by calling and claiming to be me. In short, she had been stalking us for 3 years. But here's the beautiful part. David had documented everything. Every illegal act, every boundary violation, every instance of harassment was recorded, photographed, and legally admissible. While Margaret thought she was being clever, she was actually building the case against herself. So when she stood in our living room that day declaring her intention to move into our master bedroom, she wasn't just committing trespassing. She was completing a pattern of behavior that I could now present to authorities as criminal harassment and stalking. The restraining order I had prepared wasn't a reaction to her showing up that day. It was the culmination of a year's worth of documented evidence, just waiting for her to take that final step that would justify its enforcement. As Margaret continued her performance for our guests, I quietly stepped into the kitchen and made a phone call. Not to the police, not yet, but to David, who was actually parked 2 blocks away waiting for my signal. You see, I had suspected she might try something during the housewarming. People like Margaret can't resist ruining special moments. "She's here," I said quietly into the phone. "Activate recording protocol." Within minutes, David had positioned himself where he could document everything. Margaret's illegal entry, her refusal to leave when asked, her attempts to claim residency in our home. Every word, every action was being recorded by a professional investigator who specialized in stalking cases. But I wasn't done yet. While Margaret was busy trying to manipulate Michael and impress our guests with her performance, I was implementing the second phase of my plan. You remember how I mentioned that I had studied property law during our 3 years of no contact? Well, I hadn't just studied it casually. I had actually completed a certification program in property rights and tenant law. Not because I planned to change careers, but because I never wanted to feel powerless against someone like Margaret again. I knew exactly what constituted trespassing in our state. I knew the specific legal language required to establish that someone was unlawfully remaining on private property. And I knew that once I used that language in front of witnesses, Margaret would be legally required to leave immediately or face arrest. But here's where the story takes another turn, because while I was preparing my legal maneuver, Margaret was preparing one of her own. "You know," she said, raising her voice so all our guests could hear, "I think it's time people knew the truth about how my son and his wife have been treating me. Abandoning an elderly woman, refusing to help with medical expenses, cutting off all contact without explanation. Some might call that elder abuse." The room went dead silent. Margaret had just played what she thought was her trump card, the threat of accusing us of elder abuse. In her mind, this would force us to comply with her demands rather than risk a public scandal and potential legal consequences. What she didn't know was that I had been expecting this exact accusation for months. Remember David, my private investigator? Part of his job had been documenting Margaret's actual living situation, her finances, and her health. We had discovered that far from being an abandoned elderly woman, Margaret lived in a comfortable senior community paid for by her substantial pension and Social Security benefits. She had regular medical care, social activities, and had actually told her neighbors that she was estranged from her ungrateful son and his gold-digging wife. In other words, she had been planning this narrative of abandonment and abuse for years, building sympathy among her friends and acquaintances while simultaneously stalking us. The accusation of elder abuse wasn't a desperate move. It was a calculated attack designed to force us back under her control. But I had documentation proving otherwise, bank records showing she had never asked us for financial help, medical records legally obtained through David's investigation showing she was in good health and receiving proper care, statements from her neighbors describing how she bragged about teaching her son a lesson by cutting contact with us. When Margaret finished her performance about being an abandoned elderly woman, I did something that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I started laughing. Not a bitter laugh, not a nervous laugh, but genuine, relieved laughter. Because after 3 years of preparation, after months of anxiety about when and how she would try to destroy our peace, it was finally happening, and I was ready. "Margaret," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room, "I need you to understand something very clearly. This is my home, mine and Michael's. You were not invited here. You are not welcome here, and you have exactly 10 minutes to remove yourself and your belongings from this property before I call the police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing." The silence that followed was deafening. Our guests stared in shock. They had never heard me speak to Margaret like this. Michael's eyes went wide, probably wondering where this confidence had come from. And Margaret? Margaret looked like someone had just slapped her across the face. "You can't speak to me like that," she sputtered. "I'm family. I have rights." "Actually," I continued, pulling out my phone, "you don't. As a licensed property law specialist, I can tell you that you have no legal right to remain on this property after being asked to leave. What you're doing right now is called criminal trespassing, and in this state, it's punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a $5,000 fine." That's when Margaret's composure finally cracked. The mask of the grieving mother fell away, revealing the manipulative woman underneath. Her face twisted with rage as she realized that her usual tactics weren't working. "You think you're so smart," she hissed. "You think you can just cut me out of my son's life and get away with it? I have lawyers too, you know. I'll sue you for elder abuse, for alienation of affection, for everything I can think of." And that's when I played my final card. "Actually, Margaret, you should know that everything you've said and done today has been recorded by a private investigator I hired to document your stalking behavior over the past year. Every illegal attempt to access our personal information, every instance of following us, every boundary violation has been documented and will be presented to the district attorney's office tomorrow morning, along with my application for a restraining order." The color drained from Margaret's face as the full implications of what I was saying hit her. She wasn't in control of this situation. She had never been in control. While she thought she was manipulating us, we had been documenting her crimes. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn, because as I watched Margaret's world crumble around her, I felt something I hadn't anticipated: emptiness. Don't get me wrong. I was relieved that the threat was finally over, that we could move forward without fear of her interference. But victory felt hollow in a way I hadn't expected. Looking at this elderly woman crying in my living room, surrounded by the ruins of her own making, I realized that we had all lost something in this war. Margaret wasn't just a monster. She was a deeply damaged person who had chosen to perpetuate cycles of pain rather than heal from them. Her tears weren't just tears of defeat. They were tears of a woman who had isolated herself from the family she claimed to love through her own toxic behavior. Michael, meanwhile, was processing the revelation that I had been planning for this confrontation for over a year. I could see the questions in his eyes. Why hadn't I told him? How long had I been preparing? What did this say about our marriage that I had been keeping such significant secrets? Our guests began quietly excusing themselves, sensing that this family drama needed to be resolved privately. Within 20 minutes, our joyful housewarming party had transformed into a crime scene, with Margaret sobbing on our couch while police sirens approached in the distance. As the officers took Margaret's statement and prepared to escort her off our property, she turned to me with a look of such pure hatred that it actually made me step backward. "This isn't over," she whispered. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." And in that moment, I realized she was right about one thing. This wasn't over, not because she had any power left to hurt us, but because winning this battle had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I had become someone who could plan for confrontation, who could manipulate situations to my advantage, who could destroy someone else's life with the same calculated precision that Margaret had once used against me. The victim had become the victor. But at what cost? That night, after the police had left, after Margaret had been served with a restraining order, after the house had been cleaned and our guests' forgotten items collected, Michael and I sat in our kitchen in silence. "How long have you been planning this?" he finally asked. "A year," I admitted. "Maybe longer. From the moment we went no contact, I knew she would try something eventually. I just wanted to be ready." "Why didn't you tell me?" That was the question I had been dreading. How could I explain that I hadn't trusted him to be strong enough to handle it? That I had been afraid his old patterns of submission to his mother would resurface and sabotage our defense? That I had felt the need to protect not just us, but him from his own family loyalty? "Because I was afraid," I said finally. "Afraid that if you knew what I was planning, you might try to stop me. Afraid that your instinct to protect your mother would override your commitment to protecting us." Michael was quiet for a long time, processing this. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "Do you realize what you've become?" That question would haunt me for months, because the truth was I didn't fully realize what I had become. In my determination to never be a victim again, I had developed skills and strategies that were powerful but morally ambiguous. I had learned to think 3 steps ahead, to document everything, to prepare for psychological warfare. I had become someone Margaret couldn't hurt, but I had also become someone who could hurt others with devastating efficiency. Over the following weeks, as the restraining order took effect and Margaret's legal challenges were dismissed one by one, I began to understand the true cost of my victory. Our marriage was strained by the secrets I had kept. Our extended family was divided between those who supported our actions and those who felt we had gone too far. Even our friends looked at me differently, as if they were seeing a side of me they hadn't known existed. The house we had built as a symbol of our freedom had become a fortress, equipped with security systems and legal protections that made it feel more like a prison than a home. We had won the war against Margaret, but we had lost something essential in the process: our innocence, our ability to trust in simple happiness, our belief that love could triumph over dysfunction without becoming dysfunctional itself. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that I had enjoyed parts of the confrontation. When I saw Margaret's confident mask slip, when I watched her realize she had underestimated me, when I delivered the verbal blow that sent her into tears, there had been a dark satisfaction in those moments that scared me. I had fought a monster and won, but in doing so, I had discovered monster-like qualities within myself. The question now was whether I could find my way back to being the person I wanted to be, or whether this victory had changed me permanently. As I stood in our master bedroom that night, the room Margaret had tried to claim as her own, I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She was stronger than the old Patricia, more confident, more capable of protecting herself and those she loved. But she was also harder, more calculating, more willing to hurt others in service of her own protection. She was a woman who could plan for psychological warfare and execute it flawlessly. The real question was, what would she do with that power now?